Normandy's countryside, near Bayeux, September of 1944. 5 German field cooks stood face to face with a British lieutenant, their minds racing to comprehend what they'd just heard. 3 full days had passed since their capture, and in that time, they'd braced themselves for what came next: transport to some remote detention facility, backbreaking manual labor, the permanent severing of ties with their military unit. But this wasn't that moment. The British officer gestured toward their mobile field kitchen, the beloved goulash canon, as Wehrmacht soldiers lovingly dubbed the wheeled cooking apparatus, and was making an unusual request through his interpreter. Would they be willing to prepare an evening meal? Not exclusively for themselves, mind you, but for everyone present: British troops, fellow German captives, even the displaced French locals nearby. The lead cook's face registered pure confusion. Cook? For all of you? He was convinced something had been lost in translation. This scenario defied every narrative Nazi propaganda had drilled into them about how the British treated their prisoners. 4 long years of indoctrination had painted a picture of Allied forces as cruel, vengeful captors who starved and brutalized those who fell into their hands. Yet here was this lieutenant matter-of-factly explaining a logistical problem. His division had advanced so rapidly they'd left their own supply personnel behind. Everyone was hungry, and these Germans clearly possessed both the equipment and the expertise to solve that problem. These 5 specialists had fallen into British hands during the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division's eastward push following the Normandy breakthrough. Among the typical haul of captured soldiers, infantry troops, artillery crews, scattered officers, the British had stumbled upon something unexpected: an intact Heeresverpflegungsamt provisioning detachment, complete with 5 professionally trained cooks, 3 operational mobile kitchens, and enough supplies to sustain a full German company for 7 days. September 1944, military documentation validates this unlikely meeting. The 50th Division's official war diary contains a telling entry: captured German field kitchen with personnel intact, equipment serviceable, decision made to utilize same for immediate improvement of food situation. This pragmatic approach to utilizing enemy assets wasn't drawn from any official military protocol. It was pure battlefield improvisation, reflecting the British talent for practical solutions under pressure. The German Feldkochherd, their field kitchen, was an engineering marvel of mobile efficiency. Engineered to feed between 125 and 150 soldiers from a single-wheeled unit, these kitchens could actually prepare hot meals while in motion. 2 massive kettles, each with a 65-liter capacity, could generate soup, stew, or coffee sufficient for an entire company. Wehrmacht specifications demanded these kitchens be ready to serve hot food within 30 minutes of stopping. The British Army Catering Corps rarely matched that speed. According to processing records, the senior cook, Unterfeldwebel Fritz Müller, had worked as a professional baker in Frankfurt before being conscripted. His second-in-command, Wilhelm Becker, brought hotel chef experience from Hamburg. Together with 3 additional food service specialists, they'd managed to keep their unit fed through the brutal combat that followed the Allied landings. Now, as prisoners of war, they confronted an absurd proposition: continue their profession, but serve their captors. The German cooks exchanged meaningful glances, silently calculating their options. Refuse, and they'd likely face separation, transfer to standard prisoner of war camps, possibly even shipment across the Atlantic to Britain or America. Accept, and they could maintain their team cohesion, continue practicing their trade, and quite possibly secure better treatment. Later interviews with Müller revealed the decision took less than 60 seconds. Jawohl, Müller responded, straightening his posture despite his prisoner status. We can cook. What do you have for us to work with? That simple exchange, documented in both British military records and post-war interviews, initiated one of the war's most unusual arrangements. Hours later, the goulash canone was producing steam. German hands were preparing ingredients. British soldiers queued with their mess kits in hand. The scene unfolding contradicted everything both sides had been taught about their enemies.
As twilight descended over the Normandy landscape that September evening, the scent of cooking food drew British and German soldiers alike toward an unexpected shared meal. Those initial cautious bites, the surprised appreciation, the reluctant nods of approval, these small moments launched a culinary partnership that would ultimately challenge deeply entrenched prejudices more effectively than any propaganda could. That inaugural shared meal exposed the vast gulf between German and British military food cultures. Unterfeldwebel-Müeller's crew prepared what they knew best, their regulation Eintopf, a hearty single-pot stew that combined potatoes, turnips, barley, and modest portions of preserved meat. The British soldiers eyed the steaming kettles with unmistakable wariness. Their own army catering typically served components separately, meat on one side, vegetables distinct, potatoes apart, not this Germanic approach of combining everything into one efficient vessel. "Everything's mixed together," observed one British corporal, prodding his spoon skeptically through the thick concoction. The German cook acknowledged this with a nod, using broken English and hand gestures to convey that this method maximized nutritional value while minimizing fuel consumption. British confusion deepened when they realized no bread would accompany the meal. German military cooking tradition relied on the dense, dark Kommissbrot, 750-gram loaves that soldiers carried in their personal packs, not freshly prepared with each meal. British Army documentation from 1944 shows standard rations provided 3,300 calories per soldier daily, with fresh bread delivered whenever logistics permitted. Wehrmacht regulations specified 3,100 calories, though by 1944, actual provisions had deteriorated to roughly 2,600 calories, heavily weighted toward potatoes and root vegetables. This nutritional reality was visible in the physical contrast. Well-nourished British soldiers standing alongside their noticeably leaner German prisoners. What truly baffled the German cooks was the British fixation on tea. Within hours of establishing the field kitchen arrangement, British quartermasters delivered 12 large containers of tea leaves, accompanied by white sugar and powdered milk. Ludwig Hahn, the youngest of the German cooks whose post-war memoir chronicles this period, recalled how British officers demanded tea be continuously available, not merely at designated meal times. "They consume it like water," he documented, "and grow agitated without it." British Army regulations from 1944 confirm a tea allocation of 5/8 of an ounce per soldier daily, sufficient for 6 robust cups. Meanwhile, British soldiers marveled at the German cook's resourcefulness. Vegetable scraps became soup foundation, stale bread transformed into thickening agent, bones received roasting before being boiled to extract maximum flavor. These practices reflected years of German resource scarcity that had trained military cooks in extreme conservation techniques. British Army Catering Corps training, conversely, prioritized standardization over creative adaptation. Misunderstandings proliferated. German cooks prepared coffee at sunrise, following continental European customs. British soldiers demanded tea. The Germans scheduled the primary meal at noon. The British expected it at evening. British officers initially required separate service from enlisted personnel, a class-based distinction that mystified the Germans, whose officers consumed identical food to their troops, merely in separate locations. By the second week, practical compromises took shape. Meal schedules, posted in both languages, illustrated the evolution. Breakfast now featured both coffee and tea. Lunch became lighter than German tradition dictated, but more substantial than British custom. Dinner incorporated elements from both culinary traditions. British supply sergeants provided unfamiliar items, canned tomatoes, dried fruits, exotic spices from colonial territories. The German cooks experimented cautiously, adapting their techniques. "We believed you would be monsters," Müller confided to a German-speaking British lieutenant after 3 weeks of cooking together. "We were told you starved your prisoners," the lieutenant responded with equal candor. "We thought all Germans were fanatics, yet here you stand, simply cooks like our own." Military historian Arnold Kershaw's examination of British 21st Army Group records confirms that by October 1944, at least 17 similar arrangements had developed along the Allied front, with German cooks maintaining their duties under British supervision. The 50th Division's medical officer documented improved morale in units with German cooking support, crediting more consistent hot meals and enhanced preparation variety. What originated as an expedient temporary solution was evolving into something more structured. Professional respect between cooks transcended national uniforms. When British supply trucks delivered unfamiliar ingredients, German and British kitchen personnel gathered together, comparing methods and exchanging knowledge that neither military had anticipated sharing. Netherlands near Eindhoven, October 1944. The scent of freshly baked bread, an aroma previously unthinkable at the front lines, drifted across the temporary British encampment. Within a commandeered Dutch schoolhouse, Unterfeldwebel Müller and his crew had assembled 3 makeshift ovens using brick debris, sheet metal, and components salvaged from their battle-damaged field kitchens. The British 50th Division, pushing through Holland, had transported their German cooking detachment with them, an arrangement no military regulation had ever contemplated. They inquired whether we could produce proper bread, Müller explained to a visiting British officer. So we constructed these. The ovens generated 200 loaves daily, merging German baking expertise with British white flour. These dense, nutritious loaves became prized commodities among British troops accustomed to pre-sliced tinned bread shipped from England. British supply documentation from October 1944 reveals a 40% decrease in bread shipments to units utilizing German bakers, freeing precious cargo capacity for ammunition and medical provisions. The improvisation extended far beyond bread alone. When British quartermasters supplied unfamiliar items, canned pineapple, dried coconut, American Spam, the German cooks experimented with careful deliberation. Ludwig Hahn, the youngest cook, developed particular proficiency with British tea rations, crafting a robust, sweet brew that had British soldiers forming lines to receive it. His Victory tea, brewed with added condensed milk, a touch of cocoa, and crushed hard candy, became so sought after that soldiers from adjacent units arrived to trade cigarettes and chocolate for a canteen cup. We're feeding 300 soldiers 3 meals daily from kitchens engineered for 150, British Lieutenant James Harrington documented in his October field report. The German cooks maintained 14-hour workdays without protest. Their efficiency surpasses our own catering corps. This productivity caught attention at higher command levels. By November, British Second Army headquarters had circulated a memorandum. German POW cooks may be retained at unit level where security permits and performance warrants. The cooking enterprise expanded beyond military personnel. Throughout villages along the Allied advance, German field kitchens, now marked with British insignia, yet still operated by their original crews, delivered hot meals to displaced civilians. Near Nijmegen, Müller's team fed 120 Dutch civilians daily alongside their British and German military diners. Military government documentation records this unusual arrangement. German POW catering unit providing daily meals to civilian population under British supervision, reducing demand on civil affairs food supplies. Cultural exchange flowed bidirectionally. British cooks absorbed German techniques for stretching limited ingredients through meticulous stock preparation and preservation methods. German cooks adopted British meal timing and tea service protocols. The resulting hybrid cuisine created something entirely novel, a pragmatic wartime fusion born of necessity. British soldiers taught their German counterparts to prepare custard from powdered eggs and milk. German cooks demonstrated how to make dumplings that transformed thin stews into satisfying meals. The numbers chronicle the expanding operations. British quartermaster records from November 1944 indicate one German POW kitchen team fed an average of 275 people daily using 15% less fuel and 22% fewer raw ingredients than equivalent British catering units. By December, 17 documented German cooking teams operated under British supervision across the front, producing approximately 4,500 meals daily for British troops, other German POWs, and civilians. Wilhelm Becker, the former Hamburg hotel chef, received authorization to maintain a garden behind British lines, cultivating herbs and vegetables to supplement military rations. His notebook, preserved in Imperial War Museum archives, meticulously chronicles yields: 85 pounds of turnips, 140 pounds of potatoes, 32 pounds of onions, harvested before winter's first frost. These fresh ingredients elevated standard military fare toward something resembling pre-war civilian meals.
As winter approached, these cooking arrangements became increasingly formalized. British officers issued handwritten certificates to their German cooks, designating them as essential personnel. These documents, several of which survive in archives, protected the cooks from transfer to general POW camps. What had originated as emergency improvisation was transforming into something more enduring, a recognition that former enemies could deliver essential services under appropriate conditions. Kleve, Germany, January 1945. The British 21st Army Group's headquarters mess hall, formerly a German school gymnasium, hummed with activity as Field Marshal Montgomery's staff officers queued for their midday meal. Behind the serving counter stood Unterfeldwebel Müller and his crew, now dressed in pristine white cook's garments with small POW badges discreetly stitched onto the sleeves. What had begun as battlefield improvisation had crystallized into official doctrine. British War Office Directive 7342, issued December 1944, formalized the standing of German POW cooks. German prisoners with culinary training may be employed in field kitchens and base installations where their skills contribute to operational efficiency. The document established specific terms: payment of 6 pence daily, held in trust until repatriation, mandatory weekly security assessments, and humane treatment consistent with Geneva Convention standards. This evolution from informal arrangement to sanctioned program reflected intensifying British manpower shortages as the war entered its concluding phase. By February 1945, military documentation recorded 1,263 German POW cooks working throughout British military operations in Northwest Europe. They prepared meals in field hospitals, headquarters installations, transit camps, and forward operating bases. The largest operation, at the Brussels Transit Hub, employed 41 German cooks, feeding 3,200 personnel daily. These weren't merely casual agreements. They represented systematic British policy leveraging enemy expertise for Allied advantage. For the German cooks, this work provided privileges unavailable to ordinary prisoners. International Red Cross inspection reports note they received superior housing, enhanced rations, typically 3,800 calories daily compared to standard POW rations of 2,900, and exemption from transfer to distant camps. At Kleve, Müller's team occupied a small residence near the kitchen facilities rather than sleeping in general prisoner barracks. They received weekly mail privileges months before other prisoners and earned canteen credits for purchasing personal items. The cooking preserved us, Müller later disclosed to British military historian Richard Atkins in a 1957 interview. Without it, we would have been anonymous prisoners in remote camps. Instead, we retained our professional identity and dignity. This sentiment recurs repeatedly in post-war testimonies from German cooks who served under British supervision. The status differential between cooking POWs and regular prisoners occasionally generated tension. British security reports from March 1945 document incidents where other German prisoners labeled the cooks as collaborators. At the Austin Transit Facility, regular German POWs initially boycotted meals prepared by their countrymen, yet pragmatism generally prevailed. Hunger superseded ideological objections. Within days, the protesting prisoners joined meal queues alongside everyone else. British officers' attitudes toward their German cooks evolved similarly. Initial suspicion yielded to professional appreciation. Captain William Hartford of the Royal Army Service Corps wrote in his February 1945 evaluation, "The German cooks demonstrate remarkable professionalism and adaptability. Their kitchen maintains the highest standards of hygiene and efficiency. I would gladly employ these men in peacetime." Such assessments appear frequently in British military records from this period. As British forces penetrated deeper into Germany, the POW cooking program expanded. Paradoxically, more German military cooks fell into British custody, while growing numbers of displaced German civilians required feeding. British military government established centralized feeding stations in occupied towns, often staffed by German POW cooks under British supervision. In Münster, 6 former Wehrmacht cooks prepared meals for 700 civilian women and children daily by April 1945, using American and British supplied ingredients. International Red Cross Inspector Maurice Rossel documented this arrangement during his April 1945 visit to British occupation zones. The employment of German military cooks to feed civilian populations represents a pragmatic and humane approach. These men maintain professional pride while serving their own people under difficult circumstances. His report praised the British approach as superior to practices in other occupation zones. As Germany collapsed in spring 1945, the question of what would become of these valued POW workers gained urgency. British units that had depended on German cooks for months now confronted both victory and the prospect of losing their well-functioning kitchens. The German cooks themselves faced uncertainty: repatriation to a devastated homeland or continuation in British service. Hamburg, British occupation zone, May 8, 1945. The radio broadcast announcing Germany's unconditional surrender created an unprecedented moment in the kitchen of British 7th Armored Division headquarters. Unterfeldwebel Müller and his team of German cooks froze mid-task, wooden spoons and ladles suspended in mid-air as the announcement reverberated through the converted brewery they'd operated for the preceding 6 weeks. British soldiers erupted in celebration while the German cooks maintained professional composure, continuing to prepare the evening meal despite the historical magnitude of the moment. "What becomes of us now?" Miller asked the British mess officer later that evening. The question echoed across hundreds of similar arrangements throughout British-controlled territory. The war's conclusion transformed 371,000 German prisoners from enemies into something more ambiguous: defeated nationals awaiting repatriation. Yet the German cooks occupied a distinctive position in this transition. They had become indispensable to British military operations. Within days, British military authorities issued Directive 9118 addressing this specific circumstance. German POW catering personnel may continue their duties during the transition to peace. Repatriation of these specialists shall be prioritized according to operational requirements rather than standard protocols. This bureaucratic language concealed simple truth. The British weren't prepared to lose their German cooks. For the victory celebration on May 9th, British commanders requested special meals from their German kitchen staffs, creating profound emotional complexity. At the Hamburg headquarters, Miller's team prepared roasted ham with pineapple, Duchess potatoes, and apple strudel, a meal simultaneously celebrating their own nation's defeat. British soldier Archie Jenkins documented in his diary, "Strange watching Jerry cooks prepare our victory dinner. They worked with perfect professionalism, though it must have been bitter. The meal was excellent, perhaps their way of showing dignity in defeat." Throughout the British occupation zone, German POW cooks continued their duties through summer 1945. their status transforming from prisoners to something approximating civilian employees. Payment systems formalized, with wages deposited into accounts accessible after repatriation. British military government records from August 1945 show 842 German cooks still employed across the occupation zone, producing approximately 210,000 meals daily for British personnel, other POWs, and German civilians in community feeding centers. The decision whether to request repatriation or continue working created personal dilemmas for the cooks. Wilhelm Becker, the former Hamburg hotel chef who had cultivated gardens behind British lines, submitted a formal request to remain in British service. His application, preserved in military government archives, cited the opportunity to practice my profession with adequate resources versus returning to a city without functioning kitchens or reliable food supply. British authorities approved 214 similar requests by September 1945, creating a transitional category of retained enemy personnel distinct from POWs. For those choosing repatriation, British commanding officers frequently provided individual recommendation letters. Captain Thomas Worthington's letter for Ludwig Hahn represents dozens found in archives. This man has served as a cook under my command since October 1944. His conduct has been exemplary, his skills exceptional. He has earned the respect of British personnel through his professionalism and character. I recommend him for immediate employment in civilian food service upon his return to Germany. Special arrangements marked the departure of long-serving kitchen teams. When Mueller's original group from Normandy finally received repatriation orders in October 1945, the British 50th Division organized a formal dinner where British officers served their departing German cooks. Lieutenant Colonel Richards presented each man with a small gift: a set of British measuring spoons, cigarettes, chocolate, and a signed photograph of their British kitchen colleagues.
These gestures, documented in multiple unit histories, represented recognition of professional bonds that had transcended enemy status. As trains and trucks carried German cooks back to their hometowns, many carried more than personal possessions. British authorities permitted them to take recipe cards, notebooks of techniques, and small quantities of rare ingredients like tea, spices, and chocolate. These culinary souvenirs, seemingly trivial amid continental devastation, would influence German cooking in unexpected ways during Reconstruction. The final statistics chronicle a story of gradual transition. By December 1945, British forces employed 378 German cooks. By March 1946, 127. By June, just 42 specialists retained for officers' messes and major headquarters. The rest returned to a Germany where their unusual wartime experience would prove unexpectedly valuable in the challenging years ahead. Frankfurt, American occupation zone, December 1946. The queue of hungry Germans extended around the city block, drawn by whispers of a new restaurant offering something extraordinary: unlimited tea served British style with milk and sugar. Inside the converted storefront, Unterfeldwebel Fritz Müller, now simply Herr Müller proprietor, moved with practiced efficiency behind a counter constructed from American shipping crates. The teapots, British Army surplus acquired through occupation authorities, steamed continuously as Germans experienced flavors most hadn't tasted during years of ersatz coffee and herbal substitutes. Müller represented hundreds of former POW cooks who returned to devastated German cities carrying an unexpected advantage: intimate familiarity with Allied food systems and techniques. In cities where functioning restaurants were scarce and food supplies strictly rationed, these men leveraged their unusual wartime experience into immediate employment. Their British military recommendation letters, bearing official stamps and signatures, opened doors with occupation authorities that remained sealed to most Germans. The culinary influence traveled in both directions.
In Britain, demobilized soldiers returned home with newfound respect for German cooking methods. The dense, nutritious bread they'd enjoyed from POW bakers influenced post-war British baking traditions. Army catering schools incorporated lessons from German field kitchens, particularly techniques for stretching ingredients and minimizing waste. The British Army Catering Corps' 1947 Field Manual included sections on continental efficiency measures clearly derived from German practices. Wilhelm Becker, who had cultivated vegetable gardens behind British lines, opened Hamburg's first post-war hotel restaurant in February 1947. His establishment featured a distinctive Anglo-German cuisine, traditional German dishes prepared with British organizational methods and service traditions. Contemporary descriptions highlight his dining room's unusual feature: an afternoon tea service complete with tiered stands holding small sandwiches and pastries, a direct import from British officers' messes where he'd worked for 18 months after the war's conclusion. Most significantly, many former POW cooks became pivotal figures in Germany's hotel and restaurant renaissance during the economic miracle of the 1950s. Ludwig Hahn, whose Victory tea had once been traded for cigarettes among British soldiers, established Frankfurt's Englischer Hof in 1951. Its restaurant featured dishes documenting his unique culinary journey: Tommy pudding made with powdered milk and eggs, Churchill stew featuring corned beef and root vegetables, invasion bread using British-style flour and German technique. Statistical records from West German hospitality associations reveal the impact. Approximately 340 hotels and restaurants established between 1947 and 1957 were founded or co-founded by former military cooks with British POW experience. These establishments employed an estimated 4,800 workers and served approximately 12.6 million meals annually by 1957, representing nearly 8% of West Germany's commercial food service sector. The connections forged over shared meals sometimes endured for decades. In 1962, British veterans of the 50th Division organized a reunion in Newcastle that included invitations to 7 German cooks who had fed them during the advance through Europe. 6 attended, traveling from Germany at British expense. Photographs capture former enemies sharing meals and memories, united by the universal language of food that had first connected them amid war's destruction. Hans Müller, son of the original Unterfeld Webel Müller, continued his father's culinary legacy by studying at a British hotel school in the 1960s, his tuition partially funded by a scholarship established by British veterans. His subsequent career included positions at London's Savoy and Claridge's before returning to Germany to operate his father's expanded restaurant business. This second-generation connection exemplifies how culinary bonds formed in crisis created lasting professional networks. Modern food historians recognize this wartime culinary exchange as more significant than previously acknowledged. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley of the European Culinary Institute observed in her 2019 analysis, the integration of German POW cooks into British military kitchens represents one of history's most unusual cultural exchanges. These daily interactions around fundamental human needs, preparing and sharing food, created understanding that formal reconciliation programs could never achieve. The legacy persists in subtle ways. British military dining facilities still serve a dense brown bread called Wehrmacht loaf by older personnel. German restaurants near former British bases often feature distinctive tea services. These culinary echoes, spanning decades and generations, began with that surprising moment when British soldiers, recognizing skilled professionals behind enemy uniforms, pragmatically asked their German prisoners to feed everyone. The captured German cooks, initially stunned by the request to prepare meals for their captors, ultimately demonstrated how shared food transcends artificial divisions.
Their story reminds us that human connections, formed through the simple act of breaking bread together, often prove more enduring than the conflicts that temporarily divide us. In September 1944, when a British lieutenant pointed at a German field kitchen and asked enemy prisoners to feed everyone, British soldiers, German POWs, and French civilians alike, he unknowingly initiated something far more significant than a temporary logistical solution. He created a bridge. That bridge, built daily through the universal ritual of preparing and sharing meals, allowed former enemies to see past propaganda and recognize shared humanity. German cooks discovered that British soldiers weren't the monsters they'd been told to expect. British troops learned that German prisoners were professionals with dignity and skill, not fanatics devoted to ideology. The meals themselves became a language that required no translation. When Wilhelm Becker planted gardens behind British lines, he wasn't just supplementing rations, he was investing in a shared future. When Ludwig Hahn perfected his victory tea to British tastes, he was building understanding one cup at a time. When Fritz Müller's team baked bread using British flour and German technique, they were creating something entirely new, a fusion born not from conquest, but from cooperation. These daily acts of nourishment, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of kitchens throughout the final year of war and the uncertain months that followed, accomplished what diplomacy often cannot. They transformed enemies into colleagues, prisoners into trusted professionals, and eventually adversaries into friends. The numbers tell part of the story. 1,263 German cooks serving British forces by early 1945, producing over 200,000 meals daily by war's end, and founding 340 post-war establishments that served millions. But statistics cannot capture the profound human dimension. They cannot measure the moment when a British soldier first tasted German Eintopf and discovered it was simply good food, not enemy cuisine. They cannot quantify the significance of German cooks receiving recommendation letters from British officers who had once been their adversaries. They cannot calculate the value of second-generation friendships built on foundations their fathers laid while feeding each other across battle lines. The legacy of these wartime kitchens extends beyond culinary technique or restaurant statistics. It demonstrates a fundamental truth. When we meet basic human needs together, when we feed each other, literally and figuratively, we create bonds stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. In a world that had descended into industrial-scale slaughter, where millions died fighting over ideology and territory, a few hundred cooks on both sides discovered something revolutionary in its simplicity. The enemy was just another person who got hungry, who took pride in their craft, who wanted to work with dignity. That discovery, repeated in countless small interactions over shared meals, proved more powerful than propaganda, more lasting than victory parades, more meaningful than formal treaties. The German cooks who returned home carrying British tea and recipe cards didn't just bring ingredients. They carried proof that reconciliation was possible. The British soldiers who learned German cooking techniques didn't just acquire new skills, they gained perspective that former enemies could become mentors. Decades later, when the sons of former adversaries studied together in hotel schools, when restaurants served fusion dishes born in wartime kitchens, when veterans gathered to share memories over meals they'd once prepared for each other, these moments validated what those first cooks understood instinctively in September 1944. Food is more than sustenance. Cooking is more than a profession. And breaking bread together is more than a meal. It is an act of recognition that transcends uniforms, flags, and the temporary madness of war. It is an acknowledgement of our shared humanity that no propaganda can fully suppress and no conflict can permanently destroy. The story of German cooks feeding British soldiers and British soldiers trusting German prisoners with that fundamental responsibility stands as testament to a simple but profound truth.
Even in humanity's darkest hours, we retain the capacity to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and a hot meal at the end of a hard day. That capacity, more than any weapon or strategy, may be what ultimately redeems us.